Hey guys, welcome back. Go ahead and dim the lights, find your favorite blanket, and just settle in. Tonight, we aren't looking at gilded thrones or inbred dukes. Instead, we're heading into the biting, lonely wind of the 1830s Rocky Mountains. We're going to spend a very long, very quiet time talking about the mountain men, those rugged, probably very smelly individuals who decided that society was a bit much and that living in a freezer with a grizzly bear was a solid career move. But specifically, we're looking at how they stayed alive when the sky turned white and the mercury dropped so low it basically gave up. It's a story of logs, dirt, animal skins, and a whole lot of sitting in the dark, waiting for April. So let's just float off into the wilderness and see how these guys built their way out of a frozen grave. Now, imagine you were a fur trapper named Jedediah or Silas. You've spent the last 6 months talking mostly to your horse and a very judgmental beaver. It's late November and the wind is starting to whistle through the pines in a way that suggests your toes are in immediate biological peril. You can't just head back to a Marriott. You have to build. The first thing our mountain friend has to consider is the location. You'd think any spot would do, but of course, because why not make life difficult, the mountains are actively trying to kill you. You don't build in a beautiful open meadow. That's just an invitation for the wind to treat your shelter like a bowling ball. Instead, you look for the lee side of a ridge. You want the geography to do the heavy lifting. You find a thick stand of timber, mostly because it breaks the wind, but also because, let's be honest, you're going to end up burning half those trees just to feel your fingers again. Once the spot is picked, we talk about the lean-to. This is the I have no time and I'm already shivering special. It's the most basic form of architectural desperation. You find 2 trees spaced about 8 feet apart. You find a sturdy crosspole, hopefully one that isn't rotten, because having a frozen log fall on your head at 3 a.m. is a real mood killer. You lean smaller poles against that crossbar at a 45-degree angle. And then comes the glamorous part, the insulation. You aren't headed to Home Depot for fiberglass. You're grabbing armloads of pine boughs, cedar bark, and if you're feeling fancy, maybe some dried mud. You layer the pine needles like shingles, starting from the bottom and working up, so the snow slides off rather than soaking through. It's cozy in a I am essentially living in a hedge kind of way. Inside, you build a small fire right at the entrance. The heat hits the slanted roof and reflects down onto your shivering body. It's effective, it's simple, and it smells intensely of pine resin and unwashed wool. But what if the blizzard is more than just a dusting? What if it's one of those I can't see my own hand kind of storms? Then we move on to the winter cabin. Now, calling these cabins is generous. They were more like wooden boxes where hope went to hibernate. The mountain man didn't have a level or a plumb line. He had an axe and a very strong desire not to become a human popsicle. He'd notch the logs. The saddle notch was the gold standard, so they locked together at the corners. But logs are round, and the gaps between them are basically highways for freezing air, so he had to perform the eternal ritual of chinking and daubing. This involved stuffing the cracks with moss, grass, or rocks, and then smearing the whole thing with a lovely mixture of mud and, if he could find it, animal hair. It wasn't pretty. It looked like a gingerbread house made someone who had never seen a cookie, but it worked. The roof was the real trick. You'd lay down poles, then a thick layer of sod. Yes, you were essentially living under the strip of the earth's scalp. Dirt is a fantastic insulator, though it does have the slight downside of dripping muddy water into your coffee every time the temperature climbs above freezing. Inside these little huts, the furniture was mostly just piles of furs. Buffalo robes were the ultimate luxury. A thick buffalo hide is practically a space heater that doesn't need batteries. You'd wrap yourself in 3 or 4 of those, lie down on a bed of soft pine boughs to keep yourself off the frozen dirt, and just exist. You'd spend weeks in there, Just you, your thoughts, and the sound of the wind trying to rip the roof off. You'd pass the time cleaning your rifle for the 10th time, or maybe carving a spoon out of a piece of willow, because why not double down on the domesticity? You'd eat dried meat, pemmican, which is basically a caloric brick made of fat and sadness. It's not a 5-star experience, but when the blizzard is screaming outside, that little mud-caked box feels like a palace. Then there were the dugouts. If the ground wasn't frozen solid yet, a trapper might just decide that being an honorary badger was the safest bet. You find a hillside and start digging. You use the earth as 3 of your 4 walls. It's incredibly quiet inside a dugout. The earth muffles everything. You just have to hope the hillside doesn't decide to settle and turn your bedroom into a tomb. As the weeks turned into months, these men became masters of the low-energy lifestyle. You didn't move fast because sweating in the cold is a death sentence. You moved with a slow, deliberate lethargy. You kept your fire small but constant. You watched the frost patterns grow on the inside of the door. It was a strange, suspended animation. Of course, the real danger wasn't just the cold, it was the cabin fever. Imagine being trapped in a 10 by 10 room with a partner who chews tobacco too loudly. There are accounts of men nearly coming to blows over how to properly stack a woodpile. But usually, the sheer exhaustion of surviving kept them quiet. They'd just stare into the embers, listening to the logs pop, waiting for the first sign that the ice was beginning to weep. And so they sat, enveloped in shadows and the scent of wood smoke, while the great white silence of the Rockies settled over them like a heavy, frozen shroud.
The fashion of not dying in the snow. All right, welcome back to our cozy, albeit freezing, little chat about how mountain men managed not to become part of the geological record during those brutal Rocky Mountain winters. Last time, we talked about their rather desperate yet effective architectural choices. Tonight, we're going to delve into what they wore, because in a world without Gore-Tex or heated socks, your clothing was literally the last line of defense between you and a very permanent chill. And let me tell you, their fashion sense was less about haute couture and more about how many dead animals can I wrap around myself. So, imagine our friend Jedediah again, tucked into his sod-roofed dugout. He's warmish, but the moment he steps outside, the world tries to steal his body heat. He needed layers, but not the kind you find at your local department store. He needed what was available, nature's discards. The absolute cornerstone of mountain man attire was buckskin. This was deer hide, usually tanned by the trappers themselves or acquired from Native American tribes. Buckskin is incredibly tough, relatively flexible, and surprisingly warm when properly treated. It was also, let's be honest, a magnet for dirt, grease, and every bit of campfire smoke imaginable. You wouldn't want to sit next to a buckskin-clad mountain man on a long stagecoach ride, trust me. They'd make shirts, trousers, and even jackets out of buckskin. The shirts were often loose-fitting, allowing for movement and for layers underneath. The trousers were typically reinforced in the seat and knees because a lot of their lives involved sitting on rocks, riding horses, or kneeling to set traps. And because stitching was a laborious process with sinew or tough thread, these garments often looked like they'd been patched together by a blind squirrel with a hangover, which in some cases might not have been far from the truth. But buckskin, while good, wasn't enough for the truly brutal cold. For that, you needed the granddaddy of all winter wear, furs. Specifically, buffalo robes. A buffalo robe isn't just a blanket, it's a personal sauna. These massive, shaggy hides were incredibly thick, trapping air and creating an almost impenetrable barrier against the cold. A mountain man might wear a buffalo hide like a cloak, wrapping it around his entire body, or use it as his primary bedding. Sometimes he'd even cut and sew them into coats, though the sheer weight and bulk made movement somewhat ponderous. Imagine trying to run from a bear while wearing a small car. Beyond buffalo, other furs were incorporated. Beaver hats were common, not just for fashion, but because beaver fur is incredibly dense and water repellent. Raccoon tails might adorn a cap, purely for aesthetic flair, because even when you're facing frostbite, a little bit of panache never hurts, right? Bear hides were less common for clothing, but highly prized for bedding, especially for those truly dedicated to a deep winter slumber. Now, let's talk about footwear. This was critical, because once your feet go, the rest of you is just a matter of time. Moccasins were the standard, made from deer skin or elk hide. They were soft, flexible, and surprisingly quiet for stalking game. But here's the catch. Moccasins offer practically no insulation against the cold, and certainly no protection against wet snow. So our clever mountain men didn't just wear moccasins, they wore layers of moccasins. And inside those moccasins, wool socks if they were lucky enough to trade for them, or else thick wraps of rabbit fur, grass, or even dried moss. The goal was to create as much dead air space as possible around the foot. When the snow got deep, moccasins were useless on their own. That's where snowshoes came into play. These weren't just for walking, they were for surviving. There were various designs, but the basic principle was the same. Distribute your weight over a larger surface area so you don't sink up to your chest in powder. The bear paw style was shorter and wider, good for dense timber. The long trail style was, well, longer, providing better flotation in open country. They were typically made from ash wood frames with sinew or rawhide lacing. Walking in them was an acquired skill. It's less like walking and more like a very slow, wide-legged shuffle. Imagine trying to dance the polka with 2 tennis rackets strapped to your feet. Underneath all these layers of buckskin and fur, the mountain men still needed basic undergarments. These were usually simple wool shirts and trousers. Wool, even when wet, retains some of its insulating properties, which is why it's still a favorite among outdoor enthusiasts today. Of course, washing these woolens often meant beating them against a rock or letting them air out by the campfire, so human hygiene wasn't exactly a top priority. Accessorizing was key too. A good wool cap or a fur hat pulled low over the ears was essential. Scarves, if they had them, were wrapped around the neck and face, protecting against windburn and frostbite. And mittens, often made from buckskin and lined with fur, were preferred over gloves because fingers bundled together stay warmer. The overall look? A bit like a walking pile of organic matter. Earth tones dominated, not because they were fashionable, but because that's what natural dyes offered, and frankly, they never bothered to wash anything enough for bright colors to show anyway. They were camouflaged by default, blending into the landscape of rock, tree, and snow. It wasn't about looking good, it was about preventing hypothermia. Every stitch, every layer, every carefully chosen piece of fur was a deliberate decision born of harsh experience. Their clothing was a testament to ingenuity, resilience, and a profound understanding of how to use natural materials to cheat death in the most unforgiving environments on Earth. It was a silent, personal battle against the cold, fought with skins and sinew, one frozen thread at a time. And so they moved through their frozen world, wrapped in the bounty of the land, slowly, deliberately, always conserving that precious, life-giving heat.
The culinary delights of desperation. I hope you're feeling warm under your covers because we're about to talk about the diet of the mountain man in winter. And let's just say it makes a frozen microwave burrito look like a Michelin star meal. We've built the shelter and we've donned the fur-on-fur fashion, but now we have to address the persistent gnawing rumble in the stomach. When you're burning 4,000 calories a day just to keep your blood from turning into slush, food isn't a hobby, it's fuel. Pure, unadulterated, and often very questionable fuel. The mountain man's winter pantry was not exactly stocked with variety. There was no balanced breakfast. There was only what you hauled in on a mule or what you could kill before it killed you. And at the very top of the hierarchy of mountain cuisine was the legendary pemmican. Pemmican is the ultimate survival food. It's a concentrated brick of energy that looks like a cross between a granola bar and a piece of sidewalk. To make it, you take lean meat, usually buffalo, elk, or deer, dry it out until it's brittle enough to be pounded into a powder, and then mix it with an equal amount of rendered fat. If you were feeling like a real gourmet, maybe you threw in some dried service berries or choke berries for a hint of flavor, but usually it was just meat and tallow. Why fat? Because in the mountains, fat is life. In the winter, your body is a furnace, and fat is the high-grade coal that keeps the fire going. A mountain man would eat a chunk of pemmican that was 50% grease and call it a Tuesday. It didn't spoil, it was easy to transport, and it provided a slow-release energy burn that lasted for hours. It was, effectively, the 19th century version of an energy gel, only it tasted like a greasy leather boot. But pemmican was the reserve. When a trapper was settled in his little mud-chinked cabin, he craved something hot. And that brings us to the trapper's stew, often called rubaboo or just the pot. This was a continuous, never-ending culinary project. You started with a pot of water, added some pemmican or fresh meat if you had it, and then you just kept adding things. A handful of flour to thicken it, some wild onions if you found them under the snow, and maybe a bit of maple sugar if you were feeling particularly fancy and had some left in your pack. The pot would sit over the fire for days, simmering into a thick brown sludge. It was the original slow cooker meal, except the slow cooker was a cast iron pot and the ingredients were whatever happened to be within arm's reach. The flavor was, let's call it, earthy. It tasted like wood smoke, iron, and survival. Now, let's talk about the buffalo. To a mountain man, a buffalo was essentially a wandering supermarket. When they managed to take one down in the winter, which was no small feat in 4 feet of snow, they didn't let a single calorie go to waste. They had a particular fondness for the depot of fat along the back, and the hump was considered a delicacy. But the real prize? The bone marrow. They'd crack open the massive leg bones and roast them over the fire. The marrow inside is pure, rich fat, basically nature's butter. They'd spread it on dried meat or just eat it straight with a knife. It was the closest thing to a dessert they ever got. And then there was the liver, often eaten raw immediately after the kill while it was still warm. Because when you're staring down the barrel of scurvy, you don't wait for a frying pan. You take your vitamins where you can find them. Speaking of scurvy, that was the silent killer. A diet of nothing but meat and fat is great for energy, but it's terrible for vitamin C. To combat the blackleg, as they called it, mountain men had to get creative. They'd drink tea made from the needles of the hemlock or spruce tree. It tasted like drinking a Christmas tree, and it was probably about as pleasant as it sounds, but the ascorbic acid in the needles kept their teeth from falling out. It was a bitter, piney price to pay for remaining intact. And what about beaver? You'd think they'd eat the animal they were out there to trap, and they did, but only specific parts. The beaver tail was considered a high-end treat. It's almost entirely fat and cartilage, and when roasted, the scaly skin peels off to reveal a rich, oily meat that supposedly tastes a bit like pork. The rest of the beaver? It was okay, but a bit tough and swampy. When you have a choice between an elk and a giant water rodent, you usually go for the elk. As the winter dragged on into February and March, the pantries started to look pretty grim. This was the time of starvation winter. The buffalo might have moved to lower elevations, the elk were hiding in deep timber, and the pemmican bags were getting light. This is when things got weird. There are accounts of mountain men eating their own moccasins. Now remember, these moccasins were made of untanned or lightly tanned rawhide. If you boiled a piece of leather long enough, it eventually softens into a gelatinous, semi-edible goo. It's not nutritious, and it certainly isn't tasty, but it gives the stomach something to do besides growl. They'd eat their saddles, their straps, and in truly dire cases, they'd look at their horses with a very specific, tragic kind of hunger. But for most, survival was about conservation. You didn't eat big meals, you nibbled. You kept your metabolism low. You'd sit in that dark cabin, perhaps nursing a pipe of kinnikinnick, a mixture of dried inner bark and perhaps a little tobacco to dull the hunger pangs. The smoke filled the small space, providing a tiny bit of comfort in the vast, freezing emptiness. Water was another constant struggle. You can't just eat snow. It lowers your core temperature and actually dehydrates you. You have to melt it. So a significant portion of a mountain man's day was spent tending a small fire just to turn white powder into drinkable liquid. It was a tedious, never-ending chore, usually performed in a state of mild lightheadedness from the lack of fresh greens. Yet, despite the monotony, the grease, and the occasional leather dinner, they persisted. They found a strange, grim satisfaction in their ability to endure. There was a pride in being hard, in knowing that your body could survive on nothing but buffalo tongue and pine needle tea for months on end. As the sun began to stay up just a little bit longer and the first cracks appeared in the river ice, these men would emerge from their burrows, pale, skinny, and smelling like a soot factory. They had survived another round with the mountains. Their first meal of spring, maybe some fresh trout or the first green shoots of wild leeks, would taste like heaven. But for now, they just leaned back against their furs, closed their eyes, and waited for the pot of rubaboo to bubble once more.
The quiet madness of the big white. Welcome back. I hope you're feeling tucked in and secure, because we're about to wander into the most narrow, cramped, and occasionally messy part of the mountain man's winter, his own mind. We've given him a roof of dirt, a coat of buffalo, and a stomach full of boiled leather and grease. But now we have to talk about the silence. Because in the 1830s, in a cabin buried under 10 feet of snow in the Wind River Range, there were no podcasts, no scrolling, and no one to tell you that your jokes weren't actually funny. There was just the wind, the crackle of the fire, and the increasingly loud sound of your own thoughts. This is what the trappers called the lonesomes, or more colloquially, cabin fever. But it wasn't just being bored. It was a deep psychological transformation brought on by months of sensory deprivation and extreme isolation. When the world is nothing but white and gray outside, and the interior of your world is a 10 by 10 dark box, the mind starts to do some very creative and sometimes very strange things to keep itself occupied. Imagine our friend Jedediah. He's been in this cabin for 63 days. He's counted every knot in the pine logs. He's memorized the specific way the smoke curls around the chimney stones. If he's lucky, he has a partner. If he's unlucky, that partner is a man named Stubborn Pete, who hasn't washed his face since the Jackson administration and has a habit of whistling through his teeth. In a space that small, social friction doesn't just spark, it grinds. Every habit, every tick, every repetitive story becomes a potential reason for a duel. There are historical accounts of men who spent an entire winter together, and by February they had literally divided the cabin in half with a charcoal line on the floor. They wouldn't speak, wouldn't share salt, and would glare at each other over their respective pots of rubaboo in a silence so thick you could cut it with a skinning knife. Because when you have nothing else to think about, the way your companion chews his pemmican becomes a personal insult of catastrophic proportions. But for the men who wintered alone, the solitaries, the challenge was different. Without another human voice to anchor them to reality, the boundary between the internal and external world started to blur. They started talking to things. Not just to their horses or mules, that was considered perfectly sane and quite healthy, but to the fire, to their rifles, or to the shadows in the corner. They would hold long, complex debates with themselves. A man might spend 3 hours arguing the merits of a specific trap set, playing both sides of the argument with different voices, just to hear the sound of speech. It wasn't necessarily that they were crazy in the clinical sense. It was a survival mechanism. The brain needs input. If the environment doesn't provide it, the brain will manufacture it. Then there was the whiteout hallucination. When you spend hours staring at a landscape of pure, featureless snow, the eyes start to play tricks. Trappers reported seeing distant cities, herds of buffalo that weren't there, or even figures walking through the drifts that vanished as they approached. The mountain men were often deeply superstitious, blending European folklore with the beliefs of the indigenous tribes they lived and traded with. They believed the mountains were alive, not in a poetic way, but in a literal, sentient, and often grumpy way. They felt watched. They felt that the wind wasn't just moving air, but a voice. To pass the time and keep the shadows at bay, they became masters of mindless craft. This is why so many artifacts from this era are covered in intricate carvings. A man might spend an entire month carving a single pipe bowl from a piece of pipestone or wood, detailing every leaf and vine. He wasn't doing it because he needed a fancy pipe. He was doing it because the focus required to not slip and cut his thumb was the only thing keeping him from dwelling on the fact that he hadn't seen a green leaf in 4 months. Some men turned to literacy if they were among the few who could read. A single tethered book, often the Bible, a Shakespeare play, or an old almanac, would be read and reread until the pages were translucent with grease and the words were committed to memory. They would recite poetry to the frozen trees. Can you imagine a bearded, unwashed man in a buffalo cloak standing in a blizzard shouting Macbeth into the void just to feel the vibration in his chest? It's a bit tragic, but also oddly beautiful in a desperate for a hobby sort of way. Religion also took on a different flavor in the mountains. Far from the organized churches of the East, the mountain man's faith was a raw, pragmatic thing. It was less about theology and more about a direct negotiation with the Creator to please, for the love of all things holy, let the sun come out for more than 20 minutes. Their spirituality became tied to the cycles of the moon and the behavior of the animals. They became intensely attuned to the mood of the wilderness. But we can't talk about the psychology of winter without mentioning the melancholy. This was a heavy, soul-crushing sadness that would settle in around late January, the hunger moon. It was the realization of just how small and insignificant you were in face of the continental divide. The mountains didn't care if you lived. The snow didn't care if you were cold. The universe was perfectly indifferent to your existence. For some, this realization was liberating. It meant they were truly free. For others, it was terrifying. It led to what was known as going beaver, a state where a man would simply stop caring for himself, stop tending the fire, and let the white sleep take him. To prevent this, the Mountain Man Code emphasized routine. You get up, you check the traps, even if they're empty, you gather wood, even if you have a pile, you clean the rifle, even if it's spotless. Movement was the antidote to the great quiet. When the spring finally did arrive and the rendezvous was held in the summer, these men would explode into a frenzy of social activity. They would drink, fight, tell tall tales, and gamble away a year's worth of furs in a single weekend. People often think this was just because they were wild men, but really it was the psychological bend snapping back. After 6 months of silence, they needed to make as much noise as humanly possible to prove to themselves that they were still alive, still human, and still part of a world that wasn't made of ice. They'd tell stories of the petrified forest, where petrified birds sang petrified songs, or giant creatures in the mist. These tall tales were a way of reclaiming the narrative of the mountains, of making the terrifying things they saw in the dark during the winter into something funny and manageable. So, as we leave our mountain man sitting in his cabin, watching the final embers of the night, remember that the hardest thing he had to survive wasn't the blizzard or the grizzly. It was the reflection of himself in the silence. He was a man stripped down to his most basic elements, living on the edge of the world, waiting for the first bird to sing. And with that, the fire is getting low and the snow is piling up against the door. I think it's time for us to settle into our own blankets and be grateful for the hum of the heater and the lack of stubborn Pete whistling in the corner.